Welcome back to Luis Discusses Everything, and in today's video we're going to discuss the 2022 Russo-Ukrainian War. Now, the reason I want to go over this conflict, this ongoing conflict, is because there has been a lot of misconceptions and a lot of misconstrued information in the news related to this conflict as something new, as something that came out of the blue, as something that nobody could have foreseen, right? And I want to take them as much of a balanced view as I can when explaining this conflict. So, as you know, as a lot of you know, the 2022 Russo-Ukrainian War is a conflict that really started, I would say, way back in 2014, right? But it has its roots all the way back in 2008. In the image behind me, that's building in the suburbs of Kyiv, destroyed by bombing and whatnot. This is like a common image across Ukraine. The point of it is that it would have been easy for me to put an image of Vladimir Putin or an image of Biden or an image of any of the leaders of NATO in the back screen. And I didn't want to do that because it kind of detracts from the fact of the reality of war, right? So to kind of pinpoint the start of the war, I guess you could say it's around February of this year. Negotiations between the West and Russia, or between NATO and Russia, between the Ukrainians and Russia, collapsed, and the Russian forces started rolling into Ukraine. But I want to, everybody knows that story up to this point. Everybody knows the bombardment, the considerable amount of damage done. But I want to go back in time and kind of give you the precursors to this conflict. Now, Vladimir Putin took power around the time of the 90s, taking over the fall of the Soviet Union after Khrushchev was the president. He stopped being president. Then Vladimir Putin was elected. He was a former KGB agent and whatnot. And relations with the West were pretty good up until that point, right? Until we reach around the 2008 time period where Russia launched the invasion of Georgia. Now, the reason Russia launched the invasion of Georgia is because Georgia recently joined NATO, and they wanted to, they had a government that was not very much in favor of the Russian government or Russian allied government. Now, the pretext for the conflict was that the region of South Ossetia was being attacked by Georgian army. There was a Georgian military offensive in the South Ossetian region over here in the country of Georgia, not the state, the country of Georgia, north of Turkey, northeast of Turkey and north of Armenia and Azerbaijan. It borders Russia to the north. Russia's in the north. It borders Turkey, Armenia, and Azerbaijan to its west. And the reason this is important is because it makes it into a very strategic side of the world where a lot of oil flows into this region, right? The Russian pretext of protecting the South Ossetians because of their Russian heritage, and by extension, protecting the Abkhazians over here on the northwestern part of the country, and declaring them independent provinces. So as a result of the war, the president of Georgia was ousted. And in addition to that, you had both of these regions becoming independent. Now, this was the first assertion of Russian sphere of influence, right? Vladimir Putin believed that the sphere of influence, regardless of the fact that the Soviet Union had collapsed, needed to remain intact, right? Needed to be, or at least needed to be reestablished, right? So that is basically the main reason why the Russians attacked these two sectors of Georgia and changed leadership in Georgia, because interests of the Russian government needed to be maintained in the country across the region, like in the case of Chechnya, like in the case of Azerbaijan, Armenia, and Turkey. All these countries follow suit in at least negotiating with the Russians to keep their sphere of influence intact in this region. It has a lot to do with oil. It has a lot to do with resources. It has a lot to do with historical, or at least nationalistic understanding of Russia's dominance in the region. So this was kind of like the first precursor to the 2022 Russo-Ukrainian war. This is back in 2008. The next kind of like, I would say, precursor to that is the 2014 annexation of Crimea, Russian annexation of Crimea. At this point, you're pretty familiar with the fact, with this map, you have the region of Donetsk and Luhansk, and you have the Crimean Peninsula. Back in 2014, there was a president that had the Poroshenko, if I'm not mistaken. He was in power in Ukraine, and he was ousted in a essentially a revolution that was propelled by the West. So it was motivated by the West. That's a small piece of information there by U.S. military-industrial complex. But it was also had to do with like widespread corruption. So it was a little bit of both. Upon the ouster of this president, right? This president left to Belarus. The Russians became actively involved because that president was very much pro-Russian. They wanted to avoid the election or the establishment of a leader that was not pro-Russian. So the Russians took this opportunity to control the Crimean Peninsula. So they introduced a lot of troops. There was no shots fired. It was just the complete annexation of Crimea through a referendum. They also there were also skirmishes around the Donetsk and Luhansk region, where Russia was beginning to back those separatist troops. And these two facts will be incredibly important for the actual 2022 Russo-Ukrainian war. Fast forward to 2022, and you have from February 24th onward the occurrence of the Russo-Ukrainian war, where formerly negotiations between Russia and the West completely collapsed. They were negotiating whether or not Ukraine was going to join NATO. Initially, it looked like they were going to give up Ukraine's hopes of joining NATO and giving concessions to Russia by allowing them to at least keep these two provinces, or recognizing their independence and recognizing the annexation of Crimea. So negotiations were ongoing. But they collapsed once Putin decided to launch an invasion. Apparently, what he saw did not feel like enough for him to say yes to the deal. So this is like the most up-to-date map as to how the conflict is going. So the areas in yellow are the ones controlled by the government of Ukraine, and the areas in red are the ones controlled by Russian Federation. The blue arrows are Ukrainian advances. The red arrows are Russian advances. So you can see both provinces of Donetsk over here and Luhansk over here are mainly controlled by the Russians, as well as the whole of Crimea. Most recent events have been that the Russians have annexed both Luhansk and Donetsk, and they have also like made threats about the usage of tactical nuclear weapons in the whole of Ukraine, which has prompted international condemnation. So the reason I want to point this conflict out and explain the nuances of it is to let you know that this is nothing new. This is something that has been brewing up for the past couple of decades that has culminated into this horrendous conflict that has so far led thousands and thousands of people dead. It would not be surprised if we get to 1 million. We do not know the exact figures of casualties, but it's considerable. And they have a humongous influx of refugees to neighboring countries, particularly Poland. And it has divided the world between two different blocks, ones that are pro-West and ones that are not, and created different economic spheres of influence, coupled with also the introduction of cheap Russian oil to other markets that are not Western aligned, such as China and India, and the bypassing of U.S. sanctions, essentially. So sanctions towards Russia have definitely not been at all effective in reducing the Russian forces. Now, introduction of weapons on the Ukrainian side, U.S. backing the Ukrainian side, has definitely proven successful on the battlefront. But it has definitely created more of a stalemate than an actual movement towards peace negotiations. And this is where the troublesome area lies. If there is a continuous push for the manufacture of weapons, the introduction of weapons on either side of the war, the incentive is to continue the conflict rather than to end it. And if your main incentive is not tied to ending the conflict, the ladder of escalation will only increase. That's why you have Putin using the nuclear saber rattling, right? Using the nuclear threat. Why? Now, the Biden administration has been saying that this is not something to worry about, that this is mainly saber rattling, and we should not at all worry about the consequences. But I would say we are as close to a nuclear exchange as we have been since the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1969. The reason I voice this is so that you are aware, but also so that you can communicate with your members of Congress or elected officials or individuals of higher power that have control over these decisions, and have them push for a negotiated peace agreement. So thank you so much for watching. Please leave a like, subscribe to the channel, share this video with your friends, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye-bye.